We're live. All right. Here we are. Pale Fire, Vladimir Nabokov, part three, chapter three. It's called, I thought it was called some, so you get to the end of the poem. It's called commentary here. Yeah. On page 57. So this is the longest part of the book. I'm not going to read anything from it because it's all, this is the Kinbote part. I'll just read the summary here. So this is from lines, the first 61 lines. Kinbote begins the remaining poetic commentary by explaining the line about the waxwing slain, but he soon turns to the topic to himself and his own story. He often saw those particular birds, waxwings, when he lived next to Shade, and the heraldic emblem of Zembla contains a waxwing along with a reindeer and a merman. He finds an allusion to Zembla in the poet's description of the reflection in the window. For Kinbote, that crystal land in line 12 is Zembla, my dear country. He describes the reign of the last king of Zembla, and he tells of the story of King Charles, a translator of Shakespeare and passionately addicted to the study of literature. Also alluded in the poem, according to Kinbote, is the would-be regicide Jacob Gratis. According to Kinbote, Gratis left Ohava Zembla on July 2nd, 1959, the day after Shade began the poem Pale Fire. Kinbote also has recourse to a disjointed, half obliterated draft of Shade's poem. In the draft, he finds still more references to Zembla, Charles, and Gratis. Kinbote explains he told Shade all about Zembla and King Charles, and this would form the content of Shade's poem. Even in May, Kinbote thought he could make out the outlines of some of his images in the poem. Shade would not write it down until July. Kinbote believes the material he contributed was deliberately and drastically drained from the manuscript of the poem. He concludes Sybil, Shade's wife, made him tone down or remove everything connected with the magnificent Zemblian theme. Kinbote refers to Shade as my dear friend, but he also reveals he's been watching the Shades at night with binoculars. He carries on his quarrel with Sybil by making snarky remarks about her contribution to Shade's obituary. The poem that Shade, the poem that by Shade that Sybil has published is just a draft, a much earlier effort of Pale Fire, as the expert Kinbote can see. Kinbote uses authoritative scholarly language, and his explanation of the waxwing image is not wrong, but already the first comment about the first line betrays the weaknesses of Kinbote's interpretation. He says the reader can visualize John Shade as a boy, experiencing his first eschatological shock. Eschatology is a branch of theology dealing with death and the final events in the world. Kinbote means that this is Shade's first encounter with death. From the moment that Kinbote describes the boy, he is writing his own novel. Although the commentary is usually secondary to the work of art, Kinbote is a rival artist creating his own work behind the mask of commentary. Another of Kinbote's failings as a scholarly commentator is his belief that everything is about him. No sooner has he movingly pictured the slain bird that he segs into a comment about himself. When I had the fortune of being his neighbor, I often saw those particular birds. His own artistry and his own story take the place of Shade's. He claims he has no desire to make the commentary into the monstrous semblance of a novel, but this is exactly what he does. His literary commentary becomes the monstrous semblance of a novel, parodying the way scholarly commentary swells in importance, overshadowing the work it comments on. Here and elsewhere in Pale's Fire, Kinbote's remarks are a parody of scholarly commentary. The title of the work is also a reference to scholarly commentary. In Shakespeare's play, Timon of Athens, are the lines: the moon's an arrogant thief, and her pale fire she snatches from the sun. The lines refer to the fact that the moon emits no light of its own. only the glow of the sun. Similarly, scholarly commentator Charles Kinbote piggybacks on the literary glory of poet John Shade. Like the cold moon, Kinbote has no creative fire of his own. However, Pear Fire also reverses this relationship. For most readers, the thoughts of a fictional poet are not very compelling. Most readers find Kinbote narrative of daring escape over the mountains of Zembla much more engaging than Shade's rhyme couplets. In these first notes, Kinbote also gives the first sense he is King Charles. Charles is a translator of Shakespeare and passionately addicted to the study of literature. This turns out to be Kinbote's traits as well. Kinbote also gives the first hint Zembla is not real. Zembla is that crystal land, but in Shade's poem, that crystal land is an elusive, illusory world, the reflection hanging above the snow. If Zembla is that land, it has no reality, only the reality Kinbote's literary creation gives it. So and then we get into the commentary. So we continue commenting on the world often. Kinbote reveals how lonely and distressed he was living in New Y or Rye or we I don't know. It's spelled WYE. Rye or Y. In the spring of 1959, he took a dissipated young roomer, Bob, in order to feel less lonely, but Bob betrayed him by bringing a woman home. Kinbote also feared for his life that spring. In addition to feeling lonely, he imagined jittery revolutionists might burst into his new White House and hustle him off to a moonlit wall where he would be shot. Kinbote also seems to have had persecution mania or hallucinations. At his rented house, he always finds a door, shutter, or window ajar, the trace of some clumsy intruder. A draft of Shade's poem, Kinbote claims, recounts how King Charles escaped Zembla. He was wearing a red sweater and red cap at the time he fled. His secret supporters, who were romantic, heroic daredevils, also wore red. The horde of lookalikes wasted police time. Kinbote says a commentary is a place where is a placid scholar is a place where placid scholarship should reign. Nonetheless, he takes the time to harshly criticize the preposterous defects of an essay about shade by Professor Hurley. Among the essay's failings, there is not one reference to the glorious friendship that brightened the last month of John's life. Kinbote traces John's life, including mention of Shade's father, an ornithologist, but Kinbote soon turns to the topic of King Charles and his father, Alfin the Vague. King Alfin was fond of flying apparatuses and was killed in an airplane accident. Kinbote recounts the king's youth in Zambia. Then Kinbote turns to a more pressing concern. He gave Shade a drawn plan of chambers, terraces, bastions, and the pleasure grounds of King Charles on Hava Palace in Zambia so Shade could better understand Kinbote's stories. Now Kinbote wants Sybil to mail the drawings to him in Sadar, and finally he remarks Gradus was preparing to leave Zembla while Shade wrote this canto. Okay, so Kinbote's situation in New Roy contrasts sharply with that of King Charles. Kinbote and Charles are the same person, but Kinbote speaks of them separately. Hordes of Zemblins demonstrate their loyalty to the king by wearing red. Kinbote is lonely and afraid. Not only is he friendless and knew why, but he is also intellectually alone, sharply disagreeing with other scholars. He attacks Professor Hurley, also known in the book as Professor H, for leaving out any mention of his glorious friendship with Shade. Kinbote forcibly argues with scholars about the fact that he had a friend, precisely because he did not. Nabokov continues to use dramatic irony to reveal things about Kinbote. For example, after demonstrating some wrestling moves, Kinbote receives a brutal anonymous note. The note says, uh, "You have, ha, you have ha. That's real bad, chum." He mentions the anonymous note in connection with having called emergency services. He telephoned 111 because the gold horse black cat suddenly reappeared on the threshold of the music room. The policeman who responds talks to him about whoever had broken in. Kinbote says other less kind responders would have let Kinbote believe he has persecution mania or is really being stalked by a killer or is suffering from hallucinations. These are the reader's options for this extending the story of Gratus and Charles. Either Kinbote has persecution mania or is hallucinating, or he has really been stalked by the killer. Kinbote says departed Zambla at the time. So, so that's the end of that part. That's so. I mean, there's a lot of people that think. I mean, that this Zambla King Charles is just made up by Kinbote, or Kinbote is supposed to be this guy Bodkin, or Kinbote is Charles, also the king. There's that theory that it's all the same, but there's also the theory that Shade is the only real character in here, and Kinbote's like a made up character by Shade, or the other way around, that Kinbote is the only real character. He has the only reality, and Shade is just a made up poet that Kinbote. Because so let's get into the third part of the commentary. Kinbote comments on a line about Shade's lack of athletic ability. Soon Kinbote is telling the gripping story of King Charles' narrow escape from the extremists in Zambla. Tell me more. Shade used to beg Kinbote. Charles had been in a tricky situation in the first month of the rebellion. Royalists might have been able to save him, but a foreign power poured money and troops into the Zamblan revolution. Charles refused to abdicate, but he was under house arrest. The door of every room was guarded. Charles' friend Odin, an actor, is accused of using a mirror to flash him messages. Thus, Charles is transferred to a dismal lumber room. As a child, Charles had once discovered a secret passageway from that room. He and his boyhood friend Oleg, Duke of Varal, had explored the tunnel, but they had not reached its end. Now, under arrest, Charles managed to tell Odin about the passageway secretly. Odin promised to explore the passageway the next day. Charles is anxious to escape because revolutionaries are searching the palace for the crown jewels, and if they find the tunnel, they will close it. The search has already reached the picture gallery and on Hava Palace, where the two Soviet professionals taking apart the painting of Count Colonel by Zamblan court painter Einstein. That's right. That night, Charles enters the passageway alone and leads him to a dressing room at the Royal Theater. There, Odin grabs some cloaks from a heap of fantastic raiments and hustles the king outside into this car. Word gets out that Charles has escaped. Odin and Charles must change their escape plans to avoid a roadblock. They head into the mountains. Then they part ways with Odin remaining behind as a decoy. Charles spends the night with the peasant family. The next day, he descends from the mountains. A policeman stops Charles. He assumes Charles is another red cap wearing imposter. The joke has gone too far, the policeman says, and Charles claims to be a British tourist and is let go after he surrenders his red cap and sweater. A secret message tells Charles to go. Let's see. A secret message tells Charles to go to Rippleston Cave on the coast of Zambia. Charles meets with Odin, who is disguised as a victim of the 1951 glassworks explosion. They reach Rippleston Cave. So when the two Soviet professionals and Dronikov and Nagarin search for the crown jewels in the picture gallery, they come upon one of Einstein's paintings. He employs a weird form of trickery. Like all realist paintings, Einstein uses paint to imitate such materials as wood or wool or gold or velvet, but then he inserts in the painting a real object made of one of the imitated materials. Thus, in Einstein's painting of Count Colonel is an oblong box. One side of it is made of real bronze. Kinbote has a different response to the Count Colonel's painting than to the others. He uses the occasion to assert that reality is neither the subject nor the true object of true art. The two Soviets expect to find reality inside the painted box with the real side, with the one real side. Odin remarks, they are in for surprise. The imitated box does not conceal a real receptacle, an oblong hole in the wall. The surprise is that the real receptacle does not contain anything of real value. On top of the box in the painting, Einstein has painted the beautifully executed twin lobe, brain like half kernel of a walnut. This is a visual pun between the walnut kernel and the subject of the painting, Count Colonel. Nabokov extends the joke by having two Soviets open the real receptacle. They discover it contains nothing, however, the broken bits of the nutshell. Thus, the secret depth of the painting does not contain a kernel of reality. It only contains another surface, the shell. The experience of the two Soviets is like the experience of readers who try to discover the real author of Pale Fire. Mary McCarthy believed that Kinbote was really V. Bodkin, a professor at Wordsmith. Thus, Bodkin somehow became deluded, believing he was the escaped King Charles's Zembla. The clue is that the names Bodkin and Kinbote mirror each other. Did John Shade not have a temporary neighbor named Kinbote? Did Shade exist, or did Bodkin invent him too? Bodkin is a scholar of Zemblan. Our readers to believe there is a King Charles, but no Kinbote. When a reader tears into the story looking for the secret, the trapdoor and the hidden boxes reveal only more trickery, more mass, more shells. During Charles' escape through the mountains, he runs into a man dressed like him in a red cap and a red sweater, his doppelganger. The word is usually spelled doppelganger. It comes from German and means a person's double. The 19th century saw a flood of European literatures about doubles, including Dostoevsky's The Double, Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde. A key event in Gothic tales of the doppelganger is the chilling moment when someone's reflection or double displays independent motion, as if one's mirror image could suddenly walk away from the bathroom mirror. Typically, the reflection of the double grows to possess more power than the original person. This is something of Charles' experience in the mountains. At first, Charles believes he is looking at a reflection in the water. Then the red sweatered, red capped doppelganger turns and vanishes while Charles remains immobile. Who is imagining whom? When the double or the reflection can walk away from its source. So that's, I mean, how much more of this? Okay, so we're almost halfway through here. How are we doing? Was it me? Oh, okay. So this is long, So I'll try to skip over. Okay, so apart from a few remarks in the poem, Kimbo continues with the story of King Charles. Um, uh, let's see. There's a group of hardcore extremists called the Shadows who vow to find and assassinate Charles. Members of the Shadows include Nodo, Odon's epileptic half brother who cheated at cards, and Gratus. Kinbote imagines the Shadows showed Gratus as their regicide killer of the king on July 2nd, just as Shade penned the first lines of his last poem. Let's see. Gratus is meant to be the number two man, a kind of assassin's assistant, Kinbote thinks, but Gratus should not kill kings, Kinbote added. Gratus flies to Copenhagen. The poem mentions Shade's birthday. The next day, Kinbote brings his gift next door. He again meets Sybil to cover his darkness. She says, "We did not ask you to come to the party because we knew how tedious you would find such affairs." Kinbote gives her the dressing gown he bought as a gift for Shade. He also gives her the 20th century volume of Marcel Proust, the Bibliothèque de la Pléiade. He also underlines certain passages in which one character makes an excuse for not inviting another to a party. I know you're not over fond of this sort of parties. If anything bore you, Kinbote feels he has triumphed over Sybil. Kinbote recounts Shade's opinion on various matters. He also noticed a certain Professor Bodkin was not subordinated to the head of the Russian department, Professor Pinin. In a comment to line 230, 230, Kinbote feels the hazel shade was involved in some appalling psychokinetic manifestations. A poltergeist moved items belonging to the late Aunt Maud. Kinbote explains this by saying, all the ways of our Lord are inexplicable. Kinbote is meticulous about correcting the minor errors in his commentary, but he seems unaware of his commentary's large, glaring error. John Shade's poem is not about the last king of Zambla. Kinbote notes July 5th, 1959 is Shade's 60th birthday. Then he corrects himself. My slip changed to 61st. His very next note ignores Shade's poem entirely. Shade discusses his childhood theory. A great conspiracy of books and people who hid the truth of life and death from me. In the commentary, Kinbote seizes on the phrase great conspiracy and goes off on a wild Zambian tangent about the king. His scholarly integrity is a facade. More doubles pile up in this part of the commentary. First, Kinbote describes two political positions as twins. On the one side are the Carlists and the supporters of King Charles. Their shadow twins are the extremists. If the Carlists have romantic and noble glamour, their shadow twins have opposite qualities, gothic and nasty. Readers also learn that Odon has an epileptic half brother, Nodo. In both cases, the reflection or shadow is the mirror opposite of the original. These hints prepare readers to see Kinbote and Bodkin with their reverse names as somewhat connected. In telling the story of the birthday gift, Kinbote adds a coda on the evening of the birthday party. Kinbote is snubbed by the Shades, who do not invite him. The next day, Kinbote gets his revenge by one-upping Sybil. Sybil gives a hypocritical excuse for not inviting him. She says he wouldn't have enjoyed it. Then he gives her a book. He hands her a book as a gift for Shade. He tells readers he has marked certain passages in which the party host says the same thing to someone not invited. However, the order of events is wrong in Kinbote's story of cunningly delivered insult. He brings the book over, and then Sybil makes the hypocritical excuse. Kinbote tries to prop up the logic of his story by saying he brought the book with him just in case. The words are italicized, calling attention to the problem with Kinbote's story. He thinks of the rejoinder before Sybil speaks. It just seems obvious that Kinbote made up the story of his insult to Sybil while the pangs he suffered from not being invited were real. Okay, so what do we got here? Kinbote speculates on the identity of the poet referred to but not named in Shade's poem. He then speaks of the sunset rambles he went on with Shade. On July 6th, Shade had taken such a walk with Kinbote in compensation for a bad hurt, the hurt he suffered for not being invited to the party. The poem mentions Shade's wife Sybil. From the very first, she disliked and distrusted me. He learns she referred to him as a monstrous parasite and a king-sized botfly. Kinbote says, I pardon her and everybody. He uses the poem's discussion of Sybil and John's marriage as an excuse to discuss the marriage of Charles to Dissa, the Duchess of Payne. Many advisors tried to get Charles to give up his copious but sterile pleasures and take a wife. After he had a wife, the pressure was on him to engender an heir. Kinbote refers to the draft verse about Shade's name. He said it would have been better if Shade had pursued the line of thought in the draft rather than the embarrassing intimacies of the passage about Sybil. Greatest flew to Paris as the poem was being written, says Kinbote. Greatest poses as a man selling historical papers from Zambla. Back in New Y in the present, Kinbote runs into the Shades in town. The poem's mention of Hazel waiting for a date prompts Kinbote to recall pining after Shade. Would he ever come for me? The lonely and lovelorn Kinbote wonders. Kinbote tells the story of Hazel's flirtation with the paranormal paranormal investigations when she was in college. Some college students had encountered a ghost in a barn. They said Hazel decided to investigate the phenomenon herself for a class paper. Her parents gave her permission to spend the night in the barn. And Kinbote mentions a letter circulated by Paul Hurley, the head of the English department. In his brief comments on the lines of Canto 2 about Hazel's death, Kinbote finds this part of the poem too labored and long. The poem interweaves narration of the Shades' evening at home and Hazel evening out. Kinbote says this synchronization device is already worked to death by Flaubert and Joyce. Okay, so Sybil's cruel nickname for Kinbote is like one of Kinbote's mirror words. She turns his name Kinbote into king-size botfly. However, this nickname also reveals new clues about Kinbote's identity. The index entry for Botkin V contains the note Kingbot maggot of extinct fly that once bred in mammoths and hastened their phylogenetic end. On one hand, both Kinbote and Botkin are associated with the botfly, but in the comments to line 894, Kinbote is compared to the king killer. Didn't you tell me, Charles, that Kinbote means regicide in your language? Asked Shade. Kinbote agrees his name means a king's destroyer. Thus, Kinbote is apparently both a king and a king destroyer. Commenting on Shade's ungainly looks, Kinbote says in the foreword, he was his own cancellation. This is also true of Kinbote. By pardoning Sybil, Kinbote actually heaps blames on her. In many ways, Pale Fire is a struggle over who is to have the last word, as Kinbote notes in the foreword. Who has ownership of a poem's meaning, the author or the commentator? In Kinbote's struggle to take over the poem, he has to ignore significant parts of it. Thus, when Kinbote quotes line 287, he writes only the words humming as you pack. The full line is in the poem is addressed to the poet's wife Sybil. I love you when you're humming as you pack. Kinbote's quotation leaves out the poet's love for his wife. Likewise, when he comments on the line, Kinbote says Shade should have left these lines out. In the same note, Kinbote reveals his confusion or struggle over who is the real creator, the true poet. On learning the Shades will go on vacation, Kinbote exclaims to his readers, and what is more, he had not finished my poem. The quotation marks indicate Kinbote knows the poem is not really his and is not really about Zembla. But in fact, Kinbote persists in writing a commentary to prove the poem is about Zembla and so is really his poem. Kinbote criticizes an aspect of Shade's poem shared by his own commentary. He points out that Shade had synchronized the events of the Shade's evening with those of Hazel's last night alive. Kinbote sniffs. The whole thing strikes me as too labored and long. He adds the synchronization device has already been worked to death by 19th century writer Gustave Flaubert and 20th century writer James Joyce. But Kinbote has already begun synchronizing the story of Shade, writing his own poem with the story of Gratus coming to kill Charles. In the very first comment on lines 1 to 4, Kinbote admits he gave into temptation to synchronize a certain fateful fact, the departure from Zembla of the regicide Gratus, which the date on which Shade began his poem. Kinbote's criticism of Shade's literary effect calls attention to his own. Okay, so on the day John Shade wrote line 408, Gratus was driving from Geneva to Lex, a made-up town. Gratus plans to pass himself off as an agent of Strasbourg art dealer, blah, blah, blah. Disa, let's see. Oh, yeah, so he gets to France. Disa spent the first 15 summers of her life at Villa Paradiso, her family's villa at the French Riviera. In 53, she returned there, a banished queen. She had not literally banished, but Charles would not consummate their marriage. Kinbote sees a similarity between Shade's description of Sybil in the poem and Disa. He also sees a similarity between a portrait of Disa at age 30 and idealized stylized image of Sybil in the poem. He then recounts the story of Disa and Charles' marriage and Charles' hopeless attempts to consummate their marriage. Charles has dreams of Disa, and in which his dream love for her far exceeds anything he has experienced in life. Charles goes to Disa's Riviera Villa after escaping Zembla. She invites him to stay there and make it his home. He says he will go to America instead, where he will examine literary masterpieces with brilliant and charming young people. Greatest tries to communicate with his handlers in coded English. They cannot keep the code straight in the attempt that communication fails. Kinbote shifts the focus to the present. It is said that Odin is making a movie based on a Zemblan legend. Back in New Why, Kinbote recalls he gave Shade all this marvelous material, the story of Disa and Charles, but Shade asks, how can you know all that intimate stuff about your rather appalling king is true? Kinbote replies, once transmitted by you and departing, the stuff will be true. Kinbote also promises. Once the poem is finished, he will tell Shade an ultimate truth and an extraordinary secret that will put his mind completely to rest. Kinbote comments on the line, she took her poor young life. He gives a simple, sober description of the spiritual situation. Presumably, the extraordinary secret Kinbote meant to tell Shade is that he is really the king, Charles of Zembla. But if this were true, Zembla would have to be real, and this is not certain. Kinbote's description of Gordon provides some clues. Kinbote seems to enjoy describing Gordon in Lavender Villa and Lex. Initially, Gordon is described as wearing nothing save a leopard spotted loincloth and sandals. Then suddenly he is wearing black bathing trunks and shortly after there white tennis shorts. The unreality of Gordon's costume changes points to the fact that Kinbote was not there. He's making up these details. This is also leads possibility that Kinbote has invented not just the details but the entire story. The fictional town Lex means law. It is also the root of word lexicon, a list of book on words. Kinbote enjoys describing Lex, but Gratus is uncomfortable being there. If he notices Gordon's allure, he does not enjoy it. Kinbote is metaphorically at home in Lex, in that he is at home in the realm of words. Gratus is not. Thus, his attempts at communication fall apart after his visit to Lex. When Kinbote finally comments on the subject of Canto 2, Hazel's death, he seems to reveal he is tempted by suicide. Kinbote says, the more overwhelming one's belief, the greater the temptation to get over with it is. He is discussing belief in providence. He could mean the belief in a cosmic order in which God cares for the human beings and other things. Since Kinbote has made clear his faith in God is strong, presumably he also feels his temptation to be done with this business of life. However, the temptation is also accompanied by fear of the terrible sin implicit in self-destruction. This is the crux of Hamlet's dilemma in Shakespeare's play Hamlet. Hamlet asks who would bear the whips and scorn of time and other travails of life when he himself might his quietest peace make with a bare bodkin dagger. Only the dread of something after death gives people pause. Kinbote alludes to the soliloquy when he says that some people believe gentlemen should use a bare bodkin, not the correct spelling, to commit suicide. Thus, Kinbote's own name in anagram form and perhaps the name of his true identity, Professor Bodkin, are hidden in the commentary of Hazel's death. So let's see. So how much time? So we've been going for 35. Okay, so I'm gonna break this up. Well, the index isn't going to be very long, so I'm up to line 502. So we have three more sections and then the index. So the next one's going to be or maybe we'll do five. Okay, so It's been going on a while. So like, I mean, Pale Fire. I mean, it's much like the play in Hamlet. The play in Hamlet is more important than the Hamlet the play. You know, the little like Hamlet does his little play for the king and the queen in the middle of the play. You know, and so like that's what Pale Fire is. It's like it's the is the poem the most important thing? Is the commentary the most important thing? Is it's really strange. Okay, so let's end it off there because I have to leave, and we'll continue tomorrow with with we'll get to the second part of the commentary tomorrow.